Good morning. I'm glad that you are here today on Super Bowl Sunday. I'm not going to ask you who you're cheering for. I know those who love Jesus who you're cheering for. It's just very obvious. But we are glad that you're here as we are continuing week 2 of our series called You Don't Complete Me. And the reason we have titled it that is because we don't believe that we can complete each other. The hole that sometimes we have felt in our lives, the need that we have had is only filled by Jesus. Because God created us with that need, that desire, and He is the one who knows that Jesus is what fills it. And so while we can complement each other in a relationship, we cannot complete each other in a relationship. And so we just want to title it that way to remind us that this is not a marriage series of how you can complete each other, but that happens through Jesus. But this is a marriage series on some ways for your marriage to be better. And so last week we started with how to fight, because all marriages have a fight lingering in them. Some of them have more than others, but we're going to fight in marriages because we're people, and that just happens. And this week we're going to talk about how to love. Now here's the thing about love. No one needs to learn how to fall in love, right? That's why they call it falling in love. It just happens. Like you just walk into it. It just happens to you. No one ever teaches you how to fall in love. Right? No one ever pulled you aside and gave you the plan of how to fall in love. You know this is true because if you're married, guys, you remember the first time you saw her and she had her long hair fixed a certain way. She was wearing those certain blue jeans. Her smile just did something to you, right? Ladies, you remember him the first time you saw him and he was joking with his friends and he has his hat on back, whatever it was, all right? I don't know what made you fall in love, but nobody had to pull you aside and say, now, hey, if you think you love them, here's how you fall in love. You just fell in love. It's kind of like skydiving. I've talked about skydiving here before. Like if you go skydiving, 99% of the instruction is going to be how to operate the parachute, how to land so that you don't break your legs. They don't really teach you how to fall out of the plane. You know what they say? Just fall out of it, right? You just fall. Like you don't need to be taught how to fall, and that's true in love. You can just fall in love, but here's the thing: you have to work to stay in love. Like you can just fall in love. Like I don't know what happened, man. It just happened, you know? But you have to work to stay in love. And so we're going to talk about that today. I've done a number of weddings in my life. I've only been married once, okay? But I've been at a lot of them up front. I love doing weddings because, man, it's just a good moment. You know, everybody's happy. Everybody's celebrating. Most everybody's happy and celebrating there, you know. And nobody's paying attention to me. They don't care about me. They're there to watch the couple. I get to read 90% of what I say. And so I love doing weddings. And one of my favorite parts at a wedding is when the groom sees his bride coming down the aisle and the way his face lights up and his eyes get big and he smiles and then she sees him and she smiles. And I just love seeing that moment. Like it's an awesome moment. I think it's a special time in their life. It's a great day. And as great of a day as that is, let me let you in on a little secret. The further away you get from when you fell in love, the harder it is to remember why you fell in love. Like on that day, you got it, right? You know why you fell in love. But the further you move from that moment, the harder it is to remember why you fell in love. And if you don't believe me, you're like, Michael, I'm not sure I agree with that. One of the greatest thinkers on love in our time, maybe throughout all time, said this: I've been spending the last 8 months thinking all love ever does is break and burn and end. From the great philosopher Tay. And if you're not going to believe her, I mean, there's no hope for you today, right? Like, love is hard. It's just not easy. Now, I've been married for 20 years, and certainly that does not make me an expert. I in no way have it figured out. If you don't believe me, ask my wife later. She will let you know that I don't. But in 20 years, we have learned some things. We've had 4 kids. We've had 4 dogs. We've moved 8 times. We've had some really high lows. We've had some really low lows, some really high highs. We've been apart for a long time. We've been together for a long time. We've been all around in that, and one of the things that we have learned is loving each other is not always easy. It's just not. It's just not always easy because romantic love, physical love, what makes you fall in love, those initial butterflies when he walks through the door, those initial butterflies when she walks into the room, they end. The butterflies die at some point, right? They just do. It's difficult. But we've also learned that if we won't settle for that if if we will do the work, and it is work, to keep love in our marriage, that it'll matter, that it'll change things. Because that's really the goal, right? Is after 30 years of marriage and 40 years of marriage and 50 years of marriage, is to still enjoy each other's company. The goal is not to just stay married forever. I hope that you do that. But you will have ups and downs. The goal is after 30, 40, 50 years to enjoy the person that you're married to. That over the decades you do the work to love each other. And please hear me say this, that love left alone dies. It must be nurtured. It is not enough to say we fell in love, we're good. Guys, if your philosophy is, I told her I loved her on our wedding day, if anything changes, I'll let her know, that's not going to work. That's not going to make it over the course of time. I grew up in a house in Kentucky, out in the country, and my mom loved plants. We had plants in our house all over the place. Every spring, I remember we would go, and she would buy hanging baskets, and she had certain kinds she liked, and she'd put them all over the house. I used to get in trouble because, it was really a great battlefield for my G.I. Joes, and so I would hide them in the plants, and, she would get on to me. But I remember every Friday, my mom would spend a significant amount of time watering these plants and pulling out the dead leaves in the plants. And she knew what each plant, how much water it needed. Some of them needed a lot, some of them needed a little. And she would spend, it wasn't like 5 or 10 minutes, it was a while spending time nurturing these plants because they had to be nurtured if they were going to live. And your marriage, my marriage, is very similar. It takes work. It takes nurturing. The problem is we are taught in life, in culture, that everything is about me, right? You're taught that everything is about you. And when we believe that lie and we let that lie seep into our marriage, then we think that your spouse, my spouse is here for me. My spouse is here to make me happy. My spouse is here to meet my needs. My spouse is here to show me love. But that's not what love is. In fact, Jesus teaches the reality of love. We read some of what he said this morning about it, but he says in John 15:13, no one has greater love than this, to lay down his life for his friends. What Jesus is teaching there is the opposite of how the world teaches love. Jesus is teaching that worldly love is selfish, but godly love is selfless. That you will put the other person ahead of you. If you want to love your spouse, you have to put them first. We talked about this last week, that one of the ways to fight well is to think of your spouse first. Well, for those of us, if you're like me and you have a hard time remembering a long list of things, there's good news. One of the ways you love well is also to put your spouse first. It's about how we put them ahead of our own needs. And so we're going to look at how to love. But before we can ever apply the things we're going to talk about today that we see Paul teaching us on how to love, you have to get this principle of putting them first. Men, you have to understand, I get it. You don't like the show that they want to watch with you. You hate going shopping. You don't want to do that. I understand, hey, talking's not your thing. Can I just say this with all the love in my heart? Get over it. You married them, right? Ladies, I get it. You don't understand why he wants to hunt. You hate golf. They're not even good at golf. Why would you do that? You don't know why he likes to camp. There's perfectly good hotel rooms with bed. I don't get it. Can I say this also with love? Get over it. You married them. You have to put them first in your life. You have to choose to think of yourself less. And if we think of ourselves less, then most of the issues in our relationship will not come to the level that they often come to. Because we can't be number one and our marriage be number one. We have to choose for our marriage to be first. And so I'm going to be upfront. The key to fighting well, the key to loving well is still to put your spouse first. Usually we end kind of with the main thing, but I want to tell you the main thing this morning is to love your spouse well. You have to put them first. And the reason I want you to know that first is because we're going to read a letter found, it's called 1 Corinthians. Paul writes it to the church at Corinth. And before we can apply anything he has done, we have to have in our minds, in our hearts, in our desires to put our spouse first. And so he writes to this church in Corinth that really didn't know how to love. Corinth was a wild place. And you loved yourself really well. You did whatever made you feel good. They didn't know how to love each other. And they certainly didn't know the love of God and what God had taught on love. And so Paul is writing to them to teach them to understand what true love is and what God teaches about love. And so in chapter 13 of verse 1, he says this: "If I speak in human or angelic tongues but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." Now, Paul is saying this because of a couple of reasons. He's teaching a couple of things here. The people he was writing to, maybe a lot like people today, were very performative, meaning they knew what to say to the people around them. They knew the right things to say. They would go into the temple and pray to their gods, who were who they believed were a very angry God. They had to say the right thing to pacify their gods, so that their gods would bless them and give them food and water and health. And so they would go say the right things. And so Paul knew this about them. He knows this about us, that we know how to use language and words to flatter and to compliment. But Paul's saying we can say the right things, but we don't have love just because we said the right things. That our words can be pointless. In other words, words do not equal love. Words do not equal love. We know this is true. If you're 14 or 15 or 16 and he tells you he loves you, or she tells you he loves you, they have no idea what love is. You know what they're actually saying is, I love me and you're good looking. That's what they're saying. That's their point. That's the whole of their understanding of love, is you're good looking and I really love myself. That's what they're saying, because words do not equal love. And so Paul points this out to us and to his readers in Corinth. Then he goes on to say in verse 2, "If I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith that I can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing." So again, he tells us what love is not. He's saying, hey, it's not the words we use. And now he's addressing the things that we know. And so what he's saying here is knowledge does not equal love. He's saying you can go to all the seminars, you can read all the books, you can think that you're an expert, you can be an expert on the topic of love, but knowledge does not equal maturity. That's a message for another time. And it also does not equal love. And he goes on in verse 3. "And if I give away all of my possessions and I give over my body in order to boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." Now this one is tricky, because what he's saying here is if we see someone giving away their possessions, if we see someone giving to those who in need, our response, even about ourselves, is, oh, that's a loving person. They must really love them. But what Paul is saying is if you are giving of yourself and giving of your possessions and your time and your resources, but you're doing it so that others will see you and pat you on the back, that is not love. So if you are giving so that you get, there's no love in that, which pokes a big hole in a prosperity gospel. There's no love in that. He's saying the perception of love does not equal love. Just because someone thinks you love doesn't mean that you actually do. And we know this because we're masters of fooling the people around us into thinking what we want them to think. We know this is true because we probably all can think of that couple that we saw that we thought, man, I thought they had it all together, that they were in love, but they call it quits. They end the marriage, the relationship, and we didn't see it coming. Why? Because they put on the perception of love, but that is not true love. And so then Paul, after he gives us a brief overview of some things that love is not, he then goes to describe attributes, aspects of love. Now, even if you have no church background, maybe you have never really been in church in your life, you've probably heard this somewhere before. Many of you, I would guess, had this read even in your wedding. You may have it hanging on your walls in your home, what we're about to read. Even though it's not written for marriages or weddings, it's okay. Keep it up. Don't take it off of your walls. Your marriage still counts. Here's what he says, describing love. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. It is not boastful. It's not arrogant. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not irritable. It does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. And this is a great list of characteristics of what love is and what love is not. This is a great list of truths, of elements, of aspects of love. And we're probably familiar with this passage that I just read, so we're not really going to spend much time on it, other than to say this is what love is. These are characteristics that are embedded in love. But instead, we're going to turn our attention to the last four things he tells us about love. This is a list of what love is, but then he gives us a list of four things that love does. And this is what I want to hone in on today. For you to love your spouse well, for your love to have those characteristics we just talked about, your love has to do some things. And so here's what he says in verse 7. He says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So Paul starts by saying that love bears all things. The word that he's used there is the same word for protects. What he's saying is love protects. That's what he's telling his readers. That's what he's telling us is love protects. And this is really important for us to begin with. This is one of the best ways that we can know. I said earlier that putting your spouse first is key in a fight and in love. And this is one of the best ways we can know if we are loving them well, because we can ask the question, who am I protecting? Right? Who am I protecting? Maybe your love is protecting something, but not your spouse. Maybe your love is protecting you. Maybe there's a conversation that you should have, but you won't have because it will be difficult for you. Whatever it is, there could be something in your life that you're protecting over your spouse, which is showing where your love is most directed to. I grew up watching a TV show called Seinfeld. Anybody Seinfeld fans in here? A few of you, some of you are like, I've never heard of that. It's one of the most famous shows ever. And so I felt like it was safe to use as an example. But there's an episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza is at a birthday party with his girlfriend, who he has been showing his love and compassion to. And a small fire breaks out in the kitchen. And in the episode, George shoves a clown, his girlfriend, and the old lady in front of him out of the way as he rushes out of the building to save himself. And this is silly, but it is an example of protection. Right? When it got tough, George's protection was primarily concerned with himself. Although he had been telling this girl how much he cared and liked her, when it came time for protection, he protected himself. But real love offers protection. It is willing to bear, to defend, to take on whatever for the one you love. And Paul says to love well, you have to be willing to protect them. And then he says what might be one of the most challenging aspects of love. Next, he says, love believes all things. Love believes all things. In other words, he's saying love trusts. Love trusts, not when it's earned, right? That's not the model, is, hey, when they earn it, I will trust them. It is the default response. Love's default response is to trust. And here's how this plays out in a marriage relationship. We talked about this a little bit last week. But there's two ends of a marriage. On the one side of a marriage, you have your expectations. Everybody comes into a marriage with expectations. I expect that she's going to do the cooking. I expect that he's going to do the cooking. I expect she's going to do the laundry. I expect that we're going to do the laundry. It's going to be this great bonding time as we fold clothes together, right? I expect that we're going to go on vacation once every 5 years because that's how we did it when I was a kid. I expect we're going to go on vacation every year because that's how we did it. You have expectations. All of you have expectations. You brought expectations into your marriage. But on the other side of the relationship, you have your experiences, right? I expected her to cook. She never cooks. I expected him to cook. He never cooks. I expected us to do laundry together. Nobody does laundry. Like, we just buy new clothes because it's overwhelming at this point, right? I expected us to go on a vacation every 5 years. They want to go on a vacation twice a year, right? You have what you have experienced. This is not your expectations. This is reality. This is how you are operating. This is how you are living. This is how you are functioning in your marriage. This is a fact. Your expectations are what you are hoping for. Your experiences are the things that have happened and shaped your marriage. And there is a gap in between these. And we have the choice in this gap. We can choose to do one of two things. We can choose to believe the best or assume the worst. And so we're presented with our expectations and we have lived out our experiences. And in the middle, we get to decide, am I going to believe the best about my spouse? Am I going to believe that they did not mean to hurt me, that they did not mean to mess up, that they are doing the best they can? Or am I going to assume the worst? When my experiences do not overlap and match my expectations, we have the choice to believe the best or to assume the worst. And this matters because true love, real love, reacts with trust, not suspicion. True love, if you're going to love your spouse well, you will react with trust and not suspicion. What if your marriage chose to fill that gap between your expectations, between your experiences, with trust, with believing the best? This is what Paul says love does. Then he gives another way to love your spouse. He says you protect them. He says that trust has to be there. And I think this one is the most fun. He says love hopes all things. Love hopes all. What he's meaning here is love dreams. Your love dreams together. It doesn't rely on the past to keep your love going. In your marriage, what made you fall in love might not keep you in love. Right? What made you fall in love may not keep you in love. As you grow as a man, as you grow as a woman, as you grow as a husband, and you grow as a wife, the things that meant something to you 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, those things are probably going to change. What I valued at 24 when I got married is different than what I value now. So what made me fall in love may not keep me in love. And so Paul says that love hopes. Love dreams with your spouse. You look to the future, dreaming of what could be. And here's why we need to do this, because love looks to the future to inspire love in the present. One of the most fun things that you should be able to do with your spouse is sit down and dream about what 5 years from now looks like, what 10 years from now looks like, what 20 years looks like. Where do you want your marriage to be? Where do you want your family to be? Dreaming together, listen to me, dreaming together keeps your marriage from turning into strangers being in the same home. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen couples like this. They've been married 20, 30, 40 years, and they grow apart. And he does his thing, and she does his thing. And they would say, yeah, I love him, and I love her. But there's no connection. There is no relationship there. Why? Because they stopped looking to the future together. They did not make plans on how to grow old together. They didn't think about this. There's a better way for you to go about your marriage. For you to love your husband well, for you to love your spouse well, you should look to the future. So that in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years, you're not just coexisting together, but you are still in love. Not just because of what's behind you, but because of what's in front of you. And then Paul, after giving us these three, he's always a realist. He always ends. He always gives us something that really just kind of hits home. And he ends with one more way that we love one another. It's an action that we have to take. It's not a characteristic of love. It's another action. It's something that love does. And he ends by saying this in verse 7, love endures all things. Because here's what Paul knew. Paul knew what so many of you in this room knows, is that love has to persevere. Love has to persevere. And I'll tell you a secret, if you are newlywed or not that long, this is a secret. There are no perfect marriages. Did you know that? And I'm not saying that to discourage you. I'm saying that to encourage you. Your marriage is going to have some rocky times. It's going to have some challenges. You will have seasons of joy and you will have seasons of sorrow. You will have seasons of much and you will have seasons of little. You will have seasons of rest and you will have seasons of weariness. You will have seasons of longing for things, and you will have seasons of contentment. You will have seasons of loneliness and friendship. You're going to have seasons of frustration, and you're going to have seasons of happiness. Here's the thing. I think Paul puts this endure, that love preserves last, because we have to do the other things that love requires of us first. We have to trust them. We have to protect them. We have to dream with them. And if we will do those things, if we will protect, if we will trust, if we will dream with them, then in our marriage, when we get to a season, we'll remember it's just a season. Because how you love your spouse determines your ability to persevere in challenging seasons. If you have committed to protecting them, if you have committed to trusting them, if you have committed to dreaming with them, then when you get to these seasons that are challenging, you are better able to persevere. The marriage that you wanted on your wedding day, the marriage that you dreamed about recently, or maybe in the past, it only exists if you have a love that perseveres. Because you will have to persevere in marriage. So, in our marriages, love has many qualities. It's patient, it's kind, all of those things. Love, that type of godly love has those types of qualities. But if we want to take our marriage to the next level, if you want to take your marriage to the next level, if you want to experience your marriage the way that God intends you to experience marriage, it is not enough to say that you love your spouse. I hope you do say it. In fact, we're going to practice that, okay? If you're sitting next to your spouse, I want you to turn to them right now and tell them, I love you, okay? Say it. Okay, that's good. That's good. If you're not sitting next to your spouse, one day you're going to get to do that. It's going to be awesome, okay? I love you. Like, we should say that often. We should say it all the time. We should tell them over and over and over, I love you, I love you, I love you. But it is not enough to tell them. We have to show them. Because real love, love that will help your marriage last, is a love that's not just words, it is action. We show them by protecting them. We show them by trusting them when our expectations and our experience don't exactly line up. We choose to trust them. We show this by dreaming with them. Not just looking back at the past of our marriage, but looking forward to the future of our marriage. And we show this by persevering in the ups and downs. We persevere. And you do all of this. I want to do this because you know. I know this. We know this. It's easy to fall in love, but it takes work to stay in love. If you're hoping that you fell far enough, fast enough, and hard enough to last for decades to come, I'm going to burst your bubble. You did not. There is no such thing as falling in love enough to last for the decades to come. It takes work. But if you will do the work, if you will do what Paul says that love does, your love will be what Paul says love is. So here's the picture he painted, is if you will trust in them, if you will endure with them, if you will love them and do the things that he says you should do, then the type of love you will begin to experience is a love that is patient, a love that is kind, a love that is confident, a love that is humble. You see how it works? The characteristics that we said on our wedding day that we want our love to be, it will not just be that because we want it to be. It will be that if we do the things that Paul said to do. And when we do these things, we get to experience a love that has these characteristics. And in all the weddings I've ever done, maybe I didn't do yours, but I'm guessing this is still true about yours. Each couple that I have married, they want their marriage to last forever. Now, I've never sat with them and they said, hey, we're thinking maybe 2 to 5 years, we're going to do this and then we're going to call it quits. But yeah, we want to go ahead and get married. I've never had a couple say that. I talked to them about the commitment. They're like, yes, we are in this for the long haul. We want to be together forever. That is the hope. That is the dream on that wedding day. And so I remind them, like I remind you, it's easy to fall in love, but it will take work for you to stay in love. But you can do it. You can do the work. So let me leave you with a couple of questions to think about today. Here's the first one. What grade would you give yourself on how you love your spouse. Not what grade would you give them, okay? This is you examining yourself. Like, let's just use a F to A scale. What grade would you give based on what we've talked about today, on what love does? What grade would you give yourself on how you love your spouse? Here's the next question. What grade would your spouse give you on how you love them? How would they say you do the things that Paul says you should do? You should protect, you should trust, you should what would they say? And here's my final question is why are these different? Why is there a gap between these? That's the point you want to get to. You want to get to the place where you and your spouse feel loved well. And you've got to answer these questions. You've got to talk about these things. You've got to ask. And they're going to tell you, well, I don't think that you always trust me, or we haven't dreamed together in a long time, or sometimes I don't feel like you are protecting me. And you can't get defensive and fight about that, right? None of us are perfect. There's no perfect husband in here. There's no perfect wife. Dale's not in here, right? Yeah, there's no perfect wife in here. They just don't exist. And so this is not an attack. This is an improvement. This is hey, I see this in you and you see this in me. Let's work on these things together so that we can love each other. We can do what love should do so that our love can be what love should be. You bow your heads and close your eyes. I just want to pray over your marriage right now. God, we thank you for love. You are the creator of love. Your word tells us God is love. To not know you is to not know love. And you have expressed that love to us in the greatest way ever by seeing that we are a mess and we need a Savior, and you gave your Son Jesus to die on the cross because of your great love for us. So my first prayer today, as always, if someone is here and they have not trusted Jesus to be their Savior, that they would understand that this is not an indictment on us, but it is a proclamation of your love for us. And that today they would acknowledge that Jesus died on the cross for their sins and that he rose again because he had lived a perfect life. And that when we confess our sins and believe that he died and rose again, your word tells us that we will be saved. And so I pray that if somebody today has not done that, that today they will do that. And then, God, I pray for all the marriages who are represented here today, both the current ones and the future ones. God, that we would be husbands and wives now and one day that are committed to doing what Paul tells us to do. That we are committed to protecting each other, to trusting each other, to dreaming with each other, and to persevering, that we're committed to that type of love. That is a challenging, difficult type of love, but God, your word tells us how beautiful that type of love is and how it will impact our marriages and generations that follow us. So help us to do the work of loving our spouse well. It's in your name we pray. Amen.